Hello and welcome to Lard Island, and a very happy Christmas to you if you're watching this on the day of release. Christmas is a time to be with friends and family, but we know that not everybody can manage that. So over the past month we've been doing some filming of a build project which I've been putting together for Burma in 1944 and 45. So if you're on your own this Christmas, why not join us and go on our own build journey, and I can stand in for being your Auntie Flo. Hello and welcome to Lard TV, and we're back in the workshop on Lard Island where we're about to start a new build project. Now, as many of you will know, I've been doing a lot of work on the Far East Handbook, and that has involved a lot of play testing for all the different theatres of the war, and it's also involved doing a lot of terrain building for all the different theatres that there are in the Far East and the Pacific, and that's a lot. But we're now coming on to British forces having won the battles at Imphal and Kohima, now moving it back into Burma for the reconquest of Burma on the road to Mandalay, the recapture of Rangoon, Operation Dracula, all that excitement going on. And what we're seeing here is terrain which in many ways is very similar in a way to Malaya, where we're looking at them advancing across much more open terrain with lots of paddy fields, but also lots of areas where you're going to have civilization there in terms of human habitation. So every area obviously has its own distinct look, and what we want to achieve here is something that looks Burmese. Now, identifying exactly what makes a building Burmese is something that takes a bit of research. So we've been having a look at a lot of the photographs of the period, and also having a look on Google Earth to make those comparisons with the buildings that are there today. And the look that we're looking for is kind of Indo-Oriental. You can see here that you've got an image of a building today where you can see the type of thing we're looking for. If we look for the classic Burmese building, a lot of them will look exactly like the jungle bashers that are very easy to get hold of. There's some fabulous models in MDF that we can put together for those. But of course that's very much the rural look. What we're looking here near those main lines of communications that British and Indian forces are going to be advancing down are going to be something that looks a little bit more suburban almost. So the look here is going to be much slightly different, much more modern than those old traditional buildings built out of whatever comes to hand, largely wood and plant matter. And these are going to be with a degree of that, but kind of a hybrid between the old and the new. So we're going to be seeing a lot more corrugated iron and things like that on these models. What we've done is we've taken as a basis some models from Sarissa in MDF, because a lot of these buildings are wood, consequently MDF is a great medium to work from when we're doing that. And these are the type of models that we are looking at here. These are taken from their Japanese rural range, and they really give us a nice basis, but we're not going to keep these models exactly as they are. We're going to be adding to them, and we're also going to be subtracting to them, because we want to find something that doesn't look that distinctly Japanese, have that distinctly Japanese look, but looks more Oriental generally, but with a Western influence. So one of the things we're also going to be using, especially in this video, is balsa wood. This is a piece that we have in the workshop here. It's about 2.5mm thick, and that is going to allow us to just add a little bit more detail to some of those MDF buildings to make them a bit more three-dimensional than they often are. So really the only tool that we're going to be using at this stage is going to be a scalpel and a metal ruler to enable us to get some straight lines, and we'll crack on with that straight away and start just simply cutting out some strips of balsa wood, probably around 3-4 millimeters wide, to allow us then to basically add some additional timber to those MDF buildings. So let's do that now. Okay, so that's done. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to take these models and we're going to start applying the additional wood to those to get those walls ready, because I want to let them dry first of all, because what I'm going to do is allow them to dry and just give them a gentle sanding over to take any regular edges off that MDF. And then we're going to look at the roof. So let's start with those walls. Right, well here's a couple of buildings that I've done, and you can see where I've added those extra bits of balsa wood just to give that timbered effect, which does create more depth to the model. One of the things about MDF models is they're great in many respects, but I do sometimes feel they can be a bit two-dimensional. It's very possible, if you are sufficiently talented, to use a lot of pens to highlight and get tonality and depth. I can't do that, I'm not good enough, so I just stick to the old way of sticking things on, and it creates not an illusion of 3D, but actually 3D itself. Okay, we've done the walls now. Now the roof is the area where we're going to start doing some conversion here, because 4 walls, really, you can be looking at 4 walls in any part of the world. But here, when we look at the models here, the ideal version of the Sarissa Japanese buildings, you can see the roofs have that coxcomb, if you like, along the ridge, which is a very, very distinctly Japanese feature, and that's something we want to remove from our models, because those rather attractive roofs are going to be replaced with something that looks a little bit more rudimentary in the form of corrugated iron. Right, so there we have it. There's our basic roof stuck together. As you can see very clearly from that, there's a gap there where that coxcomb's there. But now we move on to the next stage. And our big friend there is going to be Will's Scenic Series 00 and HO materials packs. Now, these are very easily accessible online and basically designed for model railway stores. We've got 2 types of corrugated material. We've got corrugated iron in this pack, and we've got corrugated glazing for asbestos roofs in this pack, just because it gives a slightly different texture, a bit of variety. What do they look like? Well, the corrugated iron actually comes in a grey plastic sheet, and the corrugated, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this, the corrugated glazing is a clear acetate sheet, which very similar patterns but slightly different, which is going to allow for a little bit of textural variety on the roof. And the idea is that we're going to be taking, you can see for this roof it's got some wooden struts in position there, so we're going to be taking that and we're going to be adding that and creating a bit of an overlap, because this is very much an area where the monsoon dominates for 6 months of the year. and that means that we're going to actually overhang our roofs to give people a little bit more protection from that, because that's not a feature that happens in Japan. The great thing about these scenic material packs is that they are easily cuttable with a pair of scissors. What I like to do then is slightly rough up some of the edges using a knife or scalpel, but I'm going to start off by measuring these up to get us the right size, and we'll then start sticking these together. You'll see here that there are going to be some slight changes to the roofs in order to do this, and we are using the actual MDF roofs that the models come with, because that's going to provide the basis to which we're going to adhere the corrugated iron, and that's then going to create, that's actually going to form the roof that we see with the wood underneath as a basis, so it's going to be very, very sturdy and solid model. And there we have it. This is our Burmese roadside shop. You can see where the goods can be displayed, and what I'm going to do is put a little bench in there on which we're going to have some goods lined up. But you can see where, if we show you underneath, we've extended the roof all round to deal with those tropical monsoons. Just make that a little bit more uniquely Burmese rather than Japanese. But you can see very little has been done to change this. Really the only differences that we've done is we've added our planking, we've slightly adapted the roof so it fits without ornamentation, and we've added that corrugated iron, which really turns it into something that you could see by the side of the road in Myanmar today. Okay, so there we have it. We've got our buildings with the roofs on, which is great, but it's still really just the starting point. This is the point where we don't start painting the buildings, but we do start decorating them, if you like, at this festive time of year. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some detail to these buildings to really enhance them more. Those roofs are fine, they certainly give that Burmese feel to it, but we want to make them look a bit more ramshackle, a little bit more run down. And if you remember that transparent sheets of corrugated iron, we're going to be adding that. We're also going to be adding some more wood just on one roof that I've got in particular, so we're just going to be adding a little bit more detail before we get these buildings ready to paint. What I'm doing now is I'm actually filling in the gaps on those roofs first, and I'm using here just a domestic household filler. This is an interior quality poly filler in the UK. It comes ready mixed. This actually comes in a tube because it's the one that people have seen me use for plastering buildings. And I'm literally, as you can see, getting some on my fingertip, just running it over, and then what I do is once that's in place, I just rub it off with a damp cloth. Where you do get a residue, and it's no problem at all because we're going to be adding a lot of weathering and rust, so it's barely going to be noticeable once we've got this painted. So let's carry on with that. So let's have a look. Here we are. We've got the transparent sheet, and I'm going to start cutting that up. What I'm going to do, the reason I bought this transparent sheet is it's much thinner than the plastic card or plastic sheet that the corrugated iron comes on. This is meant to be for glazing, but it's corrugated and it's very thin. So what we can do is when we're adding a little bit of replacement corrugated iron on top, we can just snip this out, stick it on. I'm using super glue here. A lot of people might be surprised to see me using super glue after what I've said about it, but I'm very happy to use super glue where I'm sticking things that if I was sticking wood, I'd be using PVA, but here we're using super glue because we're dealing with a plastic on some kind of other plastic. God knows the science. But what we're going to do is really add these bits on so it looks like these roofs are being repaired, makes them look more higgledy-piggledy and ramshackle. Also, you can see here that we've got a roof where we're adding some wood just to give that a look of a run-down outbuilding. And once where I've stuck that in place, what I'm doing now is just soaking that in PVA to almost seal it so it's not going to come loose. Okay, so there we are, so lots to dry there, we've got lots of glue. What I'm going to do, I reckon these buildings are pretty much at the point where we want to get them painted. After that, we're going to have a look at basing, and we're going to have a look at all the bits and pieces we're going to do with that. But the first thing I think I'm going to do with these, once everything is dried, I'm going to give it a wash over with 50% water and 50% Wargame's favourite PVA, just to really seal it all in place. Some of those transparent sheets that we put on top are only really tacked on with the super glue, which can make things go quite brittle. So what I just want to do is create that little fine skim of PVA over the top, binds the whole thing together. So we'll do that, and then we'll get them painted, and we'll be back and have a look in a few moments' time, by the magic that is lard, at the next step in the process. And here we are, we're back due to the magic of television, and we have gone through the next process. I've had a bit of a change because it's getting very cold in the workshop. And what we've done is we've added that wash of PVA and water, really just to bind everything together, allowed that to dry, and the next step in the process is really just to spray it all black with a car primer. That creates a really good basis, and then the next stage is to paint it with an exterior household paint. I use a Santex in what they call a bitter chocolate brown, but basically it's the colour of dog shit. So what we've done is we've painted up the buildings with that, and that's given them the basis we want. How you paint your buildings is of course entirely up to you. What I've done is work through it on basically dry brushing up from that brown, and then adding a little bit of soft pastel colours to suggest, you know, the paint's aged over a period of time. And you can see here the buildings that we've got finished and ready for the next stage, which is where we're going next. Basically the next stage is to take a sheet of MDF, and I'm quite keen at the moment on using slightly thicker MDF for basing, so we're looking at 9mm MDF that we've got here, which basically we've cut out with a jigsaw. We've used the jigsaw at about a 45-degree angle to chamfer that off, and then finally what we've done when we've got our bases is we've taken a bit of a blade around the top of that edge to give it a rounded finish, or certainly rounded when we sand that down. And we're now going to be using these semi-regular or semi-irregular, I guess, bases to put our buildings on. So once that's done, we're looking at adding some and working out exactly what we can add, and adding some bits of bric-a-brac to make those buildings come to life with a bit of everyday detritus as one would expect to find in a suburban, semi-urban environment in a third world country. So let's have a look at how we're going to do that and what we're going to put in place there. Right, so there we are. We've got our buildings pretty much ready. We've got our bases cut. What we're going to do now is look at how we're going to use those bases to turn this from a building into a scene. So what I've done is I've gone through my spares box, all the bits and pieces that I accumulate with different projects, and we're going to try and dress each scene. And we can see here some of the ideas that we're doing. On some of these we're going to be adding things like plant pots. On most of them we're going to be adding plants, some kind of growth, because this is an area where it's very warm, there's a lot of water, and so you're going to be getting a lot of vegetation growing there. And for example, on this scene here with the small shop, we're going to be having all those goods for sale that are there both inside and out. You can see there hopefully where I put the bench inside for those goods to be on in there. So we're then going to drill a hole where the plants are going to go, and we're going to add those with hot glue so that they stay in place. And once that's done, we're going to start off by painting them in situ. So they're effectively going to be painted whilst on the base. The next thing we're going to do is put down, just on a couple of the nicer houses, put down some stone paving out the front. And again, I'm turning to Will's here and using another one of their sheets. This is a dressed stone, which looks great for something like a York stone finish outside an English cathedral. But if we randomise this so we can mark on the size that we want, so once again I'm just simply using the base as a template and marking the size out. And if we randomise this by removing some of those stones, using the stones as a guideline, that should give us a rather attractive and not random but irregular finish. So I'm going to cut that out and stick that down in place. The building obviously at this stage is not stuck down because we're going to paint a lot of this stuff while they're on the base. So, but nevertheless, keeping the building to hand and the base, using it as a template, saves a lot of fiddling, measuring and nonsense like millimetres. So right, I'll get on with this. Right, so we've got that done, and what we do again, use the building as a template to inform us exactly where we want to put it. So we'll just make sure the building is placed as we want it to have it placed, and then again we're just applying super glue to this to get that to stick precisely. For precisely the reason I use PVA, which gives us flexibility when we're doing the wooden bits. Now I want super glue because I don't want wiggle space. I want this to be placed in place and left there so we can see that randomised finish. Those edges are going to be covered once we get the basing material on there. But for now, that'll do. I'll move on to the next one for the large house. What I need to do now is I've got the water tank we're going to put outside one of the properties, and I just need to build the brick stretchers that's going to sit on. So in order to do that, I'm just going to create a template drawing around the water tank and just abbreviating that underneath and drawing that off like that. So I'm going to create one, make that and then simply duplicate it. This doesn't have to be particularly precise, but obviously you don't want to make a mess of it. I'm just using foam board here, artist foam board, and what I'm going to be doing, as we will see in a moment, is cladding that in a brick finish using Will's OOHO Scenic Series materials pack, and that's brickwork with an English bond, which sounds like breakfast tea, but an English bond just means that bricks alternate. It's a method of bricklaying that was used before cavity walls. So let's duplicate the one with the other bit so we can see if we put them there that we're going to have something that is going to support that water tank. Now all we need to do is get our brickwork. Always keep your offcuts of this stuff, because you're always going to need fiddly bits. This is a part sheet. Obviously a whole sheet looks almost exactly like the corrugated iron in terms of size, clearly a different colour. But the offcuts always come in useful. You know, you really only need a bit here that's not much more than an inch square, but let's draw this on, and we're going to need 4 of these, 2 for each side, and then once we cut them out we're going to do an end piece, only at one end because we won't see the other end because it's going to be hidden by the building. What we'll do is we'll trim that up once that's completely dry, but we can see we've got our 2 brick piers there for our water tank, which will sit outside the larger of the houses. That'll tidy up neatly once we get it in place. Okay, the next thing we want to do is to add the plant area where they're growing crops, and what I'm going to do here is literally just use a hot glue gun to put in our rows of furrowed earth to provide the basis for placing our crops down. A gentleman who had served with the Papuan Constabulary told me that when I did my native gardens I shouldn't have put the crops in rows, but I think here, as we're looking at Burma, I think I'm going to allow them to have some rows, although I'm trying to make them a bit less regular than one would get in a European situation. So you can see what I've done there is just use the hot, I haven't stuck that down yet, which maybe I ought to do, is use the hot glue to create those furrows, and I'm going to use that hot glue here to just add that water tank permanently, so I can get this painted up in situ, which makes things an awful lot easier. So there we go. And there we have it. We have our bases painted. We have the foliage and the stones on them all undercoated, and there's a bit of work to be done here that you don't really want to watch me do. I'm going to be spraying these with an airbrush to get the greens on there, and then highlighting that with some yellows, and then going and doing a little bit of detail on the tree trunks. I'm obviously going to be painting the slabs and painting this old tank, water tank. So that's going to take a little bit of time, but don't worry, you won't have to wait as long as I do, because we're going to be back in a minute to have a look at that once that's done, and then we're going to be moving on at long last to our next step of really joining the bases and the buildings together, so we can then get that textured and everything in place. So then we're going to have a final product. So we're nearly there, we're kind of coming up to the final furlong. So we'll see you in a moment. As if by magic, we're back, and we've been doing a bit of work while we've been away. The bases have now been painted, so we've got all the details on the slabs and the water tank. We've painted all the bits of bric-a-brac that are going to go on the models, and I've set them largely to one side. What I've done now is I've actually only attached the wands where there's a very large amount, and that's outside the shop, because that covers up sufficient floor space, and I'm putting that down before I put my basing material on. The others I'm going to base first and then add the few bits and pieces that are going to go on then. So next thing we need to do is start that basing process, which is going to be based on sharp sand. Unsurprisingly, we've got two grades here. The first thing I'm going to do is sieve some out, because I want to have a finer sand on the area which we've set aside for gardening, because I think in that area they'll be looking to remove rocks and keep that soil as nice as possible for growing things. So I'm going to start off doing that now. Okay, so as you can see, we've got all our buildings glued on our bases. We've used a hot glue gun to get them rigidly in place, and on this base here we've got those goods actually ready there in the shop. We've super glued them in there and outside there. But the first step is going to be, we've taken our sharp sand and I've sieved a small amount, because that's going to be just covering this furrowed area here where we've got the gardens that are being used to grow produce by the locals. So we're just going to put our, hello Freddie, we're just going to put our PVA glue straight down on that. And keep that fairly random. I'm trying not to make this too regular after the comments by the gentleman who had served in the colonies out there, but there's going to have some degree of regularity. This is the only area that I'm going to be using with this fine sand. The rest is just going to be ordinary sand, and this is meant to be the larger house, which we're going to have some quite attractive pot plants out front. But there we go, I'm going to let that dry, so put that to one side. I've finished with the fine sand, so we'll put that in, give that a bit of a mix, and now we can start off doing the other buildings. Now you can see here that we've got the paving out the front of this property. So what I'm going to be careful to do is to take the glue up to the paving slabs and not over them. The sand is you're going to get a degree of creep anyway with the sand moving up. So the more you can avoid, the more you can avoid getting your PVA on the actual slabs, the better. So a bit of fine work there. I need a thinner brush, but let's try and do it without. What I'll do is I'll take a bit of a chance here, wiping off any bits of excess, and I'm going to do this whole front section, but I'm not actually going to do the edges at this point, and I'll show you why in a bit. So just keep off those chamfered edges, but work right the way up to it and go all the way around those plants on the front section. There we go, that's in place. Best way to do this is on a newspaper, because you'll be able to just pick it up and tip it back. And let's see what that looks like. Only has to stand there for a second, but you can see that I've avoided as much as possible getting any sand on those slabs, and that kind of creates the effect that I'm looking for. So I'm going to carry on working my way around this property. I think I'll do the back next. And again, one of the things about adding the outside to a building, you don't need to add a lot of space. All I'm going to do here is have a few sort of long straggly weeds growing out the back, but it doesn't need to be, you don't need to do a full back garden with tennis courts and swimming pools. It can be something very, very simple, just to set the scene. The fact that we've got these plants, the fact we've got this outside steps, the fact we're going to have some plant pots there is going to give this building a load of extra character, far more so than the building on its own would have if it just were to stand there like the boy on the burning deck. And last but not least, just do this bit at the side here, and again I'm keeping away from the sides. I'm going to come back to those, and there's a reason for that. If you go over it a bit, it doesn't matter. So there we go. So that's a bit of glue on the tree, never mind, that'll dry clear. And we're going to top up our PVA and carry on. So sit back and relax while I do all the hard work. Okay, so what I've done is I've covered all the bases, and you may recall that I mentioned I was leaving the edges here. The reason for that is that they're the bits where things are more likely to be knocked off if there's any higgledy-piggledy bits. So I've sieved some more sand, and I'm actually just going to cover these edges with a finer sieved sand, so we're not creating any points on those edges that is going to invite damage. Really just trying to protect the model once it's all complete. So let's do that. That is probably what I always find to be one of the most satisfying stages of the build, because for the first time we really got the sand on the base and the buildings on the base, and the two things are really tied together in one scene. The next thing we need to do is let that dry, and after that is really the most critical stage. There's no good simply adding your sand onto the base with the PVA. What you need to do once that's dry is to soak that in a mixture of PVA and water. I use about 60% water to 40% PVA, and that will soak that up like a piece of blotting paper and really hold the whole thing in place, almost literally like concrete. And that's really what we want with our terrain. This has got to be robust, it's got to be able to take the knocks, especially as I'm taking this round the shows. But we even if we're only using it at home, we know how easy it is with stuff that we're moving about to get it knocked, so it's important to get that right, and it's that second coat of PVA and water that locks it all in place. After that we're going to be moving on and really putting together the final detail, but this is really shaping up now, and it's lovely to look at these on their bases and see those buildings there with the trees and those slabs in place, and just add a little bit of sand there where I knock that. We can see how easy it is to knock things just by everyday handling. So we can see how these little scenes are coming together, and how actually having that on a base not that much bigger than its footprint allows us to really make that building into a little scene that draws us in and captures our imagination when we're looking at it on the table. And so there we go. Let's let that dry, and then we'll come back and do the next phase. And here we've done it. We've actually put the wash on this. I've washed this over with PVA, allowed that to set, and then what I did is I put a layer on here of, let's get it here, a rather grotty bottle. It's a Vallejo Sepia Game Wash. I love this. It allows you a degree of flexibility. Because we're in the Far East, I've gone with about 50-50 of the Game Wash to water. If I was doing it in Europe, I'd probably use something like 75 Game Wash to 25 water to get a slightly darker effect. But that's given me the look that I want, and we'll have a look at some pictures here which show that we've got a good basic ground colour. And what we're going to do now is we're going to dry brush that up, a really quick dry brush, and then we're going to be ready actually to take this on to the flocking stage, after which we're going to start putting on some of the fine detail. Now for dry brush, I've got two colours here. These are craft paints, these are Deco Art. This one is a golden brown, and this one is sand. Now I got those off the internet on Amazon. They're from America originally, but I find using larger pots is great for dry brushing, and the pigment in this is really quite nice, and it's a nice consistency. So what I'm going to do now is just give a dry brush over with this. As soon as that's done, a lighter dry brush over with the sand. So let's do that now. I'm using a nice flat-headed brush, that's about 3/4 of an inch. And these are just cheap brushes, relatively cheap, Dale and Rowney, but I get them from the local art shop whenever I go there, in packs of about a dozen brushes. And things like this are absolutely superb. They're a nylon acrylic brush. They're superb for doing this dry brushing because they're cheap. And this type of work does damage brushes, but consequently don't use an expensive one or a really good one. Okay, so that's done. As you can see, that's a really quick job. We'll flip this open and we'll move on to the next colour, which is the highlight, and then we're kind of done. I mean, this is literally a matter of minutes to do this. We can see, just get that brush a little bit drier. If the paint gets a bit cloppy in any areas, rather than just a dry brush, it's fairly easy. What you can do is simply and make sure you cover that area with more grass. But let's try and avoid that as much as possible. So yeah, the important thing is you're dry brushing, not painting, so you can get that nice highlighting effect there. So you can see there where I put a little bit too much paint on that. I'll just make sure that when I put the grass on, that area is specifically, that area particularly covered. That's the job done. You can see how, there you go, a bit too much paint on there, we can see we've covered that up, but we can see how that just really picks out the stones and gives texture to our base. So the next phase is to really make a difference, and we're actually going to start adding, rather than grass at this point, we're going to start adding some clumps, because we're going to place those strategically, tactically, however you want to talk about it. And what we'll then do is we'll use the static grass mix excuse me, to fill in the gaps once we've done that. So let's have a look at our clumps and how we're going to add them with super glue. The first place we're going to add clumps is on our garden area. So we're going to be fairly liberal here, but follow the ridges where the garden's been tended to. To get that effect of a garden. There we can see our garden with all its crops in it. What we're going to do is I've actually got some very long tufts here. These are about 12 mil. You can see on there that it's significant. What I'm going to do is add those around the backs of the buildings, because they're always going to be the areas which are less well maintained. They're very large and very round, so I'm actually going to cut them in half so we get a flat side to them. So let's add those on. So it will just look like areas of where we've got a lot of growth happening. So there we've got our tufts in place. The next stage is going to be to add some static grass and, well, actually a mixture that I put together, which we'll have a look at how we do that now. So we've got our bases dry brushed, we've got our clump foliage in place. What we're now going to do, we're going to add some grass. Now I often talk about grass and how I do it, because I don't just use one thing. So what I thought I'd do is, I'm running a bit low in my box, I thought I'd show you how I mix up the ingredients to get the kind of ground cover that I'm looking for. So let's have a look at what's involved there. This can vary depending on what geographical area we're going to cover, but normally the basis of all my grass mixes is this, which is a spring grass from Knock. So what I'm going to do there is put a decent handful of that in place. Let's add a little bit more to that, because we can get this box fairly full. So 3 random handfuls of that. I want to add a little bit of difference in tone. So this is a summer 2 mil grass. What's the length on this? Let's have a look. I think this is really quite short. Well, I don't think Knocker going to tell us, but looking at it, I'd say that is a 2mm grass as well. So this is from War World Scenics. This is a summer 2mm, so it's a bit darker, so we're going to get a bit of variety. So we're just going to put one handful of that in there, so 3 to 1 so far. The next thing we're going to add is this. This is by Serious Play, and this is a rather thick, I don't know what you call it. It's like a grass fibre, but you can see it's really quite fine, but not as fine as a sort of sawdust, well, very, very fine you get. So I'm just going to add a handful and a half of that. What I'm also going to add is a dark green scatter flock. Only a bit of this, because this is really quite dark, but we want that in there for a bit of variety, so a pinch of that. And then these are very finely cut up sponge type material, I'm not sure what you call it, but we're going to put a couple of large pinches of that in there, and we've got a dark version of that as well. And we're going to put one large pinch of that in, and let's give that a bit of a mix up so we can see what that's looking like. In fact, the best way to mix that up actually is to put the lid on it. As you can see, this box has seen the walls, and give it a good shake up like a decent cocktail, and we can see we've got quite a nice mix there. You'll see some of that looks like bits in it, which is the next and final ingredient here. Depending on what I'm doing, this is actually herb de Provence, which I bought a huge sack of, and I'm going to dump that in there. I just want to reserve a bit, but this is an area where we're going to see a lot of plant fibre, because there's a lot of palm trees and the like. So let's shake that up, and that should give us the look that we want for our ground cover mix. So you can see that where there were all those different colours, they've really blended together to make a mix with highs, lows, lots of different colours in there. So that's basically how I put together my mix for ground cover. If I was doing that for Europe, I would not use this ground cover material. I'd probably put in some bright colours for flowers, meadow flowers, but I'm not. I'm doing it for the Far East. So let's now have a look at how we add that ground cover to our bases. First thing I'm going to do is get a large brush, an old pigskin brush, but it's actually got quite a fine point on it, because what we're not going to do is just blanket cover that ground. We're going to selectively dab glue on there. So let's get that happening. We turn course to our trusty friend PVA. Put a big dollop of that on our old saucer that we use, and the technique here is to think about where there'd be high levels of traffic, and we're certainly going to see, remember, cover up those bits where we've got too much paint. We're certainly going to see high levels of traffic around here, but the bit where people don't walk is on the very edge, so we're going to see grass along those edges. I try and avoid putting the grass on the prominent rocks, because they're there for visual effect, so let's avoid them, and we're just dabbing on bits of, and again, areas where the grass is going to go, and again what we're going to do is avoid the doorway, because obviously apart from that very edge we're going to avoid the path where people are likely to be walking, and keep the brush wet as well. And now get dabbing. Where can people not walk? they can't walk at the base of a tree because they'll be bumping into the tree. So, and we dabbing that on like the spots on a leopard, if you like, because once we put the ground cover on, it expands to fill the space available. So let's just take this up to remember, where people's feet don't go, that's where we're going to put this stuff, so we're leaving some areas well trodden. Now we're coming to the back. Now this is where people are less likely to be walking, so we can increase the amount of dots we're going to put on here. Okay, so once again, we're better off doing this when we've got a bit of newspaper. Let's get our mix on, and we'll leave that for a minute. And move on to the next one. We can see that grass is drying on there. You can still see the white coming through a bit, but that doesn't matter because we're going to go on and do our next step. If you remember at the outset, I set aside some odds and ends for each particular house. For this one, I put aside some beads which are going to use as pots, and I accidentally bought some trees. I intended to buy some trees that are about 4 inches high, and I ordered them on eBay. And they arrived that high, which wasn't what I wanted. But actually, as a pot plant, that's going to make a nice addition to a Burmese gentleman's residence. So let's use our super glue to get that pot in place. It's a bead, as we know, but it's going to serve as a pot, one on each side of the door, as all the most fashionable Burmese gentlemen have. And what we'll do is we'll actually use that plant to hold that in place, so we can see, well, I'm not going to move it, but we'll be able to see that we've got our delightful pot plant, as was large tree, already in place. So let's put this, no, that ain't working. Let's put that in and then put the pot in place, which was a much better idea. So let's a bit more super glue. And there we've got our pot plant in place. The other thing I had there was a little wheelbarrow. That was part of the wall bases set, but I like it for really just adding something to any garden that you're going to have. So if you're growing produce, you probably want a wheelbarrow. So let's add that on there, on the side of that property. Now I'm not going to rattle that about too much, but we'll have a look at some photos when that's finished. And we'll just set that to one side, because that one is actually pretty much done. And there we are, that's the end of part 1 of our Big Burma build project, because we've actually made a second film which we're going to be releasing tomorrow, the 26th of December, Boxing Day, and hopefully you're going to be able to join us for that and see me actually take on a scratch build project rather than simply adapting some existing models. For now, let's raise a glass and say a very happy Christmas to you.